don't call ourselves Professor Walker.
Right?
Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Chevry, and I, along with Patty Zimmerman, am a co-director of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. Just about a year ago now, we had to shutter our Embodied Festival, and we went online and ran 3 online exhibitions. But we're back now, so welcome to the 24th edition of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. This year has been historic. COVID, Black Lives Matter protests, vaccines, masks, the attack on the Capitol, remote learning, the Zoomiverse. In the midst of this, a yearning for connection around ideas and community. This year, for the first time in 24 years, we are entirely virtual. We have 2 FLEFF mottos this year. The first is FLEFF, a different environment. The second is we are the screen. Both were developed by our festival producers, Anne Michelle and Phil Wild. We're delighted and honored to have you here today from all over the globe for today's event, a celebration of the online journal Media Plus Environment, emphasis on celebration. We'll be doing short introductions to save time for dialogue. And during the event, please check the chat for more complete biographies and also quotations from our guests, and also postings of different information that will be talked about during today's discussion. So it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, longtime collaborator, professor of screen studies in the Roy H. Park School of Communication, Patricia Zimmerman. So take it away, Patty.
Thanks so much, Tom, and welcome everyone from near and far, from Ithaca and across the United States and from across the globe to this really special event, which is a celebration of the new extraordinary online journal, Media Plus Environment. And as we've learned in producing this event, the plus is very important because it's not an and. Media Plus Environment is a new online journal published by the University of California Press, and it explores media plus environment, as they say on their webpage, as a crucial conjuncture for our time. It is looking at media plus environment in terms of how they both affect each other, inhabit, and constitute each other. It features a very pluralistic wide range of scholars, creative practitioners, and artists. It is a very aggressive and innovative exploration of media text and context. And I made a list of some of that just to show you how wide-ranging and provocative this journal is. histories, technologies, networks, infrastructures, data, social media, artistic and creative works, regulatory pipelines, and policies. It combines people from humanities, social science, sciences, and the arts. It includes another wide range of interviews, commentaries, scholarly articles, reviews, audiovisual works, and artists describing their practices. I want to share an inventory of the topics this really provocative journal takes on. And I have to say, strap on your seatbelt. It's staggering. Let me just read you what some of these are. Atomic histories and indigeneity of water, ocean humanities, the controversies over the filmmaker Michael Moore, the impact environmentally of streaming media, which we're on right now, reconfiguring oil as media, the nuclear Pacific, coral rescues, decolonizing and indigenizing journalistic cartography of environmental struggles, climate comedy, not something you hear that much, 3D laser scanning, and seeds and weeds. It's just so exciting to read this journal, but it's not as exciting as meeting the journal editors and stream editors who will tell us more about their deep and very bold reconfiguration of how we think and do and live in media plus environment. I'm going to send it over to Janet and Alenda now.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Patty and and FLEFF. We're thrilled to be here, and it is wonderful to realize that people are gathered from near and far, and that also means that there are many peoples and lifeways to acknowledge in acknowledging the places from which we speak. So we, the panelists, are from the Finger Lakes region, of course, where the festival is housed, the state of Vermont. Several of us are from nearby the University of California, Santa Barbara. And so the honor falls to me to acknowledge that UC Santa Barbara was founded on the exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples, and specifically on the lands, villages, and unceded territories of the Chumash Nation. And we acknowledge the Chumash people, their elders, past and present, as well as their future generations. And then also, since this is a panel about a scholarly journal, the significance of Native American people's place and the place of traditional ecological knowledge in the learning and research activities of this university and of universities throughout the United States and then beyond in the various unique regional circumstances. So with that, I would like to hand it over to the first of the 5-minute presenters, Adrian Ivakiv.
And I will introduce Adrian Ivakiv for everybody. He's one of the editors of Media and Environment. He's the author of many, many books. His most recent is Shadowing the Anthropocene, Eco-Realism for Turbulent Times. Welcome, Adrian.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for this opportunity. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, all of you. I will be sharing 3 images, and I can't actually see them now. I can see the screen opening up. The first of these images will stand for what I'm calling location, which is something filmmakers and audiences tend to know about. The second for globality or dislocation, if you will. And the third for the intermediary or mediating realm that connects the two in various ways. It's that intermediary realm where I'll argue Media plus Environment and the Finger Lakes Film Festival both do most of their work. So first image, location. I'm speaking to you from Burlington, Vermont, about 6 hours away by car from Ithaca, car being the only way to get there from here these days, unless you have lots of time. I live here on traditional Abenaki land. I research and teach here and interact with the local community, sometimes through forms of print or digital mediation, such as the local newspaper. and other times through an organization called Ecoculture Lab, which I established with some artists and colleagues as a collaborative interface between the University of Vermont, where I work, and the city of Burlington, an interface that works between environment, the arts, and the sciences. This image that you're seeing is not from Burlington. Images dislocate, but it's the job of those who use them or discuss them, like Media Plus Environment, to relocate them. This image shows very global geological activities, volcanic in this case, in a very local and concretized form. I took this photo when I visited a place called Furnas, a town on São Miguel Island in the Portuguese Azores. I've been there twice and I love the place. So I'm connecting three places here, Burlington, São Miguel, and Ithaca, through an image and a story. Second image, globality or dislocation. The last few hundred years have seen a buildup of a world that is global in scale through colonization, through what we call modernization, through capitalization or the spread of a capitalist economy to the global scale. Most of us swim daily within that global world. We go online, read or see the news there, communicate with our friends there. Our data gets stored on data servers far away, processed and sold by tech companies and so on. But we aren't in a position to shape that world hardly at all. That world is undergirded by a very global infrastructure consisting of satellites like this one, networks of overland and undersea cables, and a constantly churning system that produces things out of the earth and leaves behind trash heaps once they're no longer needed. The global shapes our lives, but we don't shape it. Third image, the intermediate or mediating realm, which is the realm in which connections are made and networks and alliances are built around specific and often conflicting articulations or ways of piecing together a common world through story, image, and feeling or affect. This is where political organizing takes place. It's also where Media Plus Environment and the Finger Lakes Film Festival do much of their work. Both of the latter aim to connect local audiences, readers, viewers, as well as the authors and places they write about, in our case, or make films about, in yours, to the wider world within which we might be able to coordinate our efforts, scaling up to better be able to shape the global. This is all we have for global shaping, our efforts to connect across and build alliances using story, image, and feeling. Filmmakers and film festivals do it, authors and scholars do it. The intermediary space is the space of mediation. It's the critical zone, to use a term that's moved from environmental science to a wider community recently. Studying how that zone works technically, infrastructurally, ecologically, as well as affectively, emotionally, and cognitively is what I see our journal as doing. Reshaping it is what our extended community, our blog, our author-reader networks, our interaction with film festivals like this, is what we hope to do more of. As we do, we reconstitute the environments that connect us. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. And thank you for these three powerful images. Our next speaker is Christina Wacht, and she is one of the stream editors for Media and Environment. She's the author of many books and articles in German and English. Her research focuses on epistemic and aesthetic relations between sciences, humanities, medias, and technologies. Christina, welcome.
Yes, thank you all for having me. I'm really exciting to be part of this wonderful film festival. And I wanted to speak very briefly about how I became a stream editor. I did a conference together with a couple of colleagues from the US and Germany 2 years ago, and it was a conference on modeling the Pacific. oceanic research in science, technology, and humanities. And this conference was really an experiment in itself, because at the beginning we didn't really know if we would find engaged scientists and engineers who would actually be willing to share their insight and their work in a way with humanities scholars that would be understandable to us. So we spent about a year trying to find local scientists here at UCSB and Caltech who would be willing to participate in this conference to speak about how they actually model the oceans and parts of the oceans. So the purpose of this conference was really enabling a dialogue between marine and climate scientists on the one side, and scholars from media, literature, history, and the social sciences on the other side. And our focus was really not just to speak about the outcome of climate science or oceanography, not just the outcome of their research or their models, but really speak about and understand better the processes that are involved in these scientific models and the conceptualizations of oceans in the humanities as well. Now, the conference was awesome. It was really a wonderful experience. But then the question came up, how can we actually turn this into a publication? And that was when I met with Alenda and Janet and had this wonderful opportunity to actually turn the publication of the conference into a special issue, or rather stream of Media and Environment, which was really a new journal back then. And I and my collaborators, Sebastian Vierken and Rolf Kittler, are still in the process of finalizing our stream. So what I'm talking about today is actually not yet online. You will find it probably within the next 1 or 2 weeks online on the journal website, but we're not yet there. And the question really was, how can we put something as interdisciplinary as it was in our conference into a publication format? Because scientists, of course, do not publish essays. When they publish formalized languages, they publish data, they publish mathematics. So the question was, how can we put this into a publication format? And this is where Media and Environment really turns out to be great, because it's an open access online journal, and it also allows us to have different formats, explore different formats. So we can address in this issue, in the special stream, the problem that scientists write about things that we can only speak about, and vice versa. So there's a problem of understanding between scientists and humanities scholars, because the means of publications are, of course, different in these cultures. So Media and Environment enables us to actually publish not just written essays, but video lectures by the scientists. And that would be a good moment to actually go into the next slide, Alenda. So these are some images from scientific presentations that are in the form of video lectures going to be published on ocean floors, ocean currents, the surface of oceans, but also problems. Some of the scientists speak about the problems that are involved in their research. The ocean is a very alien environment to all kinds of electromagnetic sensors and technologies. So in a way, this is an interesting exploration into the obstacles that scientists face. So if you're interested in how scientists actually model ocean floors, or how they gather their data, what technologies they use, you will probably find a video that gives you a little bit of an insight there. And then maybe in the next slide, Alinda. So these are images from the text publications. Most of them are written by humanities scholars. And this is a more classic format where, you know, we have peer-reviewed articles on ocean floor measuring by means of sonic technologies. Or Stefan Helmreich did a wonderful piece on the FLEFF, which is actually a research platform that looks like a ship, but it can actually turn 90 degrees in space. And this platform is meant to measure waves in the ocean. And the lower images on the bottom of the page are showing air gun arrays that are used to measure the ocean floor and find oil resources in the ocean by means of big bangs. And Lisa Hahn, who's the author of that article, does a great job at actually looking in the economic and political backgrounds of the scientific research, something that scientists don't really often talk about. But of course, their research sometimes is so invasive and actually deadly to sea mammals that is also questionable. And so the humanities are taking a little bit more of the historic and critical, political, economic, critical view on this broad field of oceanic sciences, marine sciences. And yeah, maybe if there are any questions later, I'm happy to go into that. But one of the most important outcomes for me in this project is really that there's much more media theory actually contained in oceanography than I thought. And there's actually more oceanography in media theory than I thought. So this juxtaposition of media theory, media studies, and oceanography and marine sciences is very productive. And because we are editing a special stream and not an issue, which is also another wonderful feature of our of this journal, is that I actually hope that we can continue publishing the stream. So once we're done with the first batch, we will try to broaden our perspective a little bit more, which right now is very much focused on this question of how do scientific models work and what is their historic and political background. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina, for that wonderful elaboration of the relationship between oceanography and media studies. Our next editor is Alenda Cheng. She is one of the editors of Media Plus Environment. She's the author, most recently, of the book Playing Nature: Ecology in Video Games. And she is also the co-founder of the digital media studio Wireframe. Welcome, Alenda.
Thank you so much. Let me advance my own slides. Okay, so I'm actually going to use my time to talk a little bit about another stream. So Christina just shared her thoughts about modeling the Pacific, and I am going to talk about another one that we call Mediating Art and Science, which I co-edited with Adrienne Abaki. And when we put out the call, we were really looking for responses in some ways to an old divide that was described by the scientist turned novelist C.P. Snow. So he gave a lecture back in 1959 at Cambridge where he outlined the two cultures of basically the humanities and the sciences, and sort of what was keeping them apart or keeping them from being able to have a dialogue, productive dialogue with each other. And what Adrienne and I tried to do was to reframe this to think about, well, where does media fall in this kind of age-old debate between art and science? Or what role can media play? And so we were interested in a lot of possible responses, including how might scientists actually incorporate media or mediating practices in their work, as well as how might artists include science within their work. And I've pulled out two of the examples from the stream that I think are really exemplary in this regard. And so this really incredible, very striking image is from an essay by Danielle Christensen, who is actually working at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab as a data scientist now, but is trained as an ecologist. And this is from her fieldwork while doing her PhD at Berkeley. And it's of her transect of Sequoia National Forest. And she was working specifically on red fir populations. And what was really interesting about this is that she went into the field and did the kind of traditional on the ground ecological field work, which involves camping and mosquitoes and you know, a fair amount of rugged discomfort. But she also lugged all this really expensive LiDAR equipment into the woods and produced these really stunning images using LiDAR, which is essentially ground level radar, and then took these millions of data points that constitute the virtual forest into the virtual Keck caves at UC Davis, where you can actually stand in a booth with virtual reality gear on your body and sort of float above the forest and interact with the data set as if you were there, right? And so in her piece, she really thinks about what is it to kind of translate a forest into all of these different registers. including other ones like photography and measuring moisture and salinity and other biogeochemical factors. But I think it's a really beautiful rumination on how ecology as a science is changing and being shaped by currents and big data, and how she makes a case for the value of this kind of mediation, but also makes the case for the continued relevance of fieldwork, right? So having that embodied encounter with the forest is still very precious. The second example is actually from the artist Ellie Irons, who is now a PhD student not too far away at RPI, and who has founded several artist collectives. But in this particular case, it's the Next Epoch Seed Library. And they had a project that was called the Lawn Lab, or a kind of experiment in disturbance and rewilding, where they dug up these square sections of sod in Troy, New York, and on the RPI campus. I don't know how they got permission for that, but they did. and saw what kind of native seedlings were still within that plot. So this is the seeds and weeds that Patty referred to before. And I think both of these examples, one is a scientist who's using media, another is an artist who very much is also a naturalist and a scientist in their approach. And I think both of these speak to a kind of principal concern of the journal, which is that we define media very broadly, maybe even too broadly, but we'd rather it be that way than be too narrow. So we don't see media as just being a sort of handmaiden or communicative instrumental tool for delivering the content of science or delivering messaging, right? But we actually see media as both the mass media that we typically think of, but also the very landscapes that we live in and the bodies that we share that are permeable to our surroundings. And so I always joke that, if you ask a scientist, I think this is actually something very intuitive to them, because if you are a microbiologist, you're comfortable with taking a swab of your face and culturing that on an agar plate. And that is media, right? Or that is a kind of medium. So I think, that just sharing these, and we have other examples within the stream on climate comedy, and more recently refiguring oil in art practice. And I think we might have more in the future coming up. So I encourage you to take a look at those. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you for bringing some wonderful ideas, especially of rewilding and permeability, into our discussion today. Our next speaker is Stephen Barunda. He also works on media plus environment. He is an MA PhD student in film and media studies at University of California, Santa Barbara, with a focus on environmental media studies, Latin American and Latinx and Southern Cone media. And he is not only a scholar, but he is also a filmmaker. Welcome, Stephen.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. So as Patty said, my name is Stephen Barunda. I'm the coordinating editor for the journal. So it's really my role to act as sort of a liaison between the editors, the press, and authors. Also, just in regards to kind of taking care of any sort of problem solving that needs to be done in regards to finding particular materials that may be needed for publication and so on. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes here today for my portion to talk about sort of two very practical pillars of the journal, and how we're trying to go about doing that in regards to, first, environmental justice, and second, thinking about the role of the journal as operating or providing different forms of mentoring for graduate students specifically. So of course, when I was brought on board, the team was thinking through the first stream, States of, and of course the voices of filmmakers were very important, obviously, in this process in terms of thinking about some of the foundational questions and topics in relation to environmental media studies. So while that state substream was being formed, as I mentioned, the voices of filmmakers were very important, but especially diverse filmmakers from different contexts in the world. And so there was one filmmaker in particular who, during my time as a resident of Chile, that I had run into in another context, which was actually in one of the museums in Santiago. I was able to view one of his exhibits. I began to learn more about his work. His name is, you see him on the screen here in one of his films. His name is Francisco Huachuqueo. And as I was mentioning, so he's a museum curator, an artist, a professor also. And so the opportunity to do an interview with him, allow him to be one of the central voices driving the States of Stream, became something that we were really interested in. And of course, because of the sort of generous, intelligent, very provocative scholar that he is, the interview went wonderfully, unsurprisingly so. So that interview is called Mapuche Cosmovision and the Cinematic Voyage, an interview with filmmaker Francisco Huachuqueo Perez. So in this interview that we were able to do with him, he speaks about filmmaking as a form of resistance. So he is from the Mapuche community in Chile, which their traditional territory is central southern Chile. So a form of resistance against the Chilean nation state in terms of its extractive practices. So that's of course central in his filmmaking, and then also a sort of poetics in the sense of a poetics that is deeply concerned with Mapuche spirituality and cosmovision, and so these are also things that we discuss in the interview, which I certainly encourage everyone to read when they have a moment. So the image we see here is from one of his films, Ilwin, The Earth Smells of Father, which is touching on the ways in which traditional community practices are interwoven and passed on through practices of agricultural and engagement with the land. His most recent film, which we also have a link to, I believe, is called Spirit Women. And this film is a really transnational engagement of solidarity, where he speaks with female activists and poets from across indigenous communities in the Americas, and basically allows them to be in conversation with each other through poetry, and poetry that is specifically very environmentally oriented. So for our journal, this work is of course of extreme importance in terms of the ways in which we're trying to be a transnational journal, a journal that's deeply involved with a number of communities and contexts. This interview also allowed us to have the opportunity to publish in a multilingual format. So we have a Spanish interview and an English interview, and this is something that we're hoping to continue in regards to a number of articles that we're hoping will be coming out shortly over the next several months in Mandarin, actually, which is quite exciting. So I also wanted to speak for a moment about some of the practical mentorship opportunities that the journal has provided for graduate students, myself being one of them. So in conjunction with the journal, or in collaboration with the journal, there's been a graduate student writing collective that's been formed and fostered actually by one of our advisory board members, Mona Damluji, who's also a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And so that collective of students have been able to foster different conversations with each other in regards to the environmental humanities, very broadly conceived, sharing and exchanging of ideas and writing practices and so on. So I think, again, there's a way in which we see here that the journal is being deeply committed to issues of environmental justice in all contexts across the globe. And then also in terms of very practical engagements with graduate students and trying to foster the next generation of scholars in the environmental humanities specifically. So yeah, those are just the two things that I wanted to talk about for a few minutes. So thank you for allowing us that space.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for raising a really critical idea about the transnational nature of the journal and its commitment to multilingual publication and multilingual encounters. Our next speaker is Janet Walker. Janet Walker is also one of the founding editors of Media Plus Environment. She is the author and editor of many books. Her most recent is Sustainable Media, Critical Approaches to Media and Environment, co-edited with Nicole Starozelski. Janet. Janet, I think you're unmuted. Thank you.
Oh, I made the rookie mistake. I'm sorry, I was still muted. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be here. It's really exciting to be talking in the context of a festival about a scholarly journal. It's quite extraordinary. I think after listening to my colleagues and being inspired by their own work and their way of formulating and talking about what it is we do, I think I'll start in a slightly different place than what I anticipated. And it might be the beginning of a zoom out to the broader conversation that we're looking forward to having with everybody who's gathered here today, including members of the editorial advisory board. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to work with a colleague from our campus who is in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Marine Biology, and he's a soil scientist. And Constance Penley, who's here, will know this, and some others might know it as well. And Josh and I decided that we were going to mount a Critical Issues in America year-long programming series. And it was going to be about sea level rise, because we thought that sea level rise would be a really great way to think about media technology from a humanities perspective and a science perspective. So he said, well, why don't we call it Representing Sea Level Rise? And I said, no, Josh, we can't call it Representing Sea Level Rise, because that might imply that what we want to look at are films and videos about sea level rise in different regions of the world. But yet we want to do more than that. We want to talk about interactive visioning tools, and we really want to delve into the kinds of things that Christina was talking about in mentioning the contributions to the stream modeling the Pacific. So I said, well, Josh, why don't we just call it Modeling Sea Level Rise? And he said, no, we can't call it modeling. Modeling for a scientist is something very specific. So we ended up calling it Figuring Sea Level Rise, because it was a term that wasn't already spoken for. And as we were talking, it was really interesting to try to communicate with one another about the way in which we each see media. And I think that many scientists see media as a tool that they use to conduct their research, which is to conduct these experiments and develop new knowledge. So they use advanced computing, or they might use tidal gauges to measure sea height, or sensing to measure land subsidence. So all kinds of media that pervade and inhabit our air, land, and sea. And they just tend to think of these as the way that they crunch the numbers, or the way they visualize ideas for themselves primarily, and for the scholarly community, and then also to a wider public. But for us, these aren't really tools. These mediated means of knowledge seeking are what it is that we study and what it is we engage with. And Josh told me he's a soil scientist and he's worked in the Arctic for several decades. And he told a story, which was one year he went up to the Arctic in the winter instead of the summer, when he would normally go, since that wasn't the academic year, and since it was easier to conduct research in the Arctic over the summer. But one year he went up in the winter, and he probed down below the ice mass and discovered, put a camera down there and discovered green shoots, growing plants. And it was that discovery that changed his way of thinking about the whole season. He realized that indigenous in the Arctic think about the growing season as starting in the winter. And then I said, so you see, Josh, isn't it wonderful, this tool that you used to probe down below the ice actually had an effect on your findings, on your research findings, and on your whole thought process about what it is you're doing. And then he said, well, Janet, the tool was a shovel. And so I said, okay, shovel as media. And I had to rest my case for a moment. But the point I'm trying to make is, following up on what my colleagues have also said, is that the journal is not only about films and videos that deal with environmental issues, but also about advanced computing and all these technologies and that pervade our world. And we have a responsibility as media scholars, because these media are also affecting the environment and, in some cases contributing to global warming, climate disruption of all kinds, weather volatility, or environmental despoliation. So what do we as media scholars make of the fact that our scholarly object can contribute in so many ways that we can talk about later to environmental despoliation, but at the same time can be used to develop new knowledge? So the thing that leads us to is, what can we as humanities scholars or scholars conducting humanistic social science research contribute? If the scientists are creating new knowledge, what is that we do? What is it that we do? And I think that one thing that humanities scholars can contribute is the proliferation of questions, rather than finding answers, which is the obvious thing that people would want to do in developing new knowledge. What about the proliferation of questions? We are not really about disambiguation. We are about arraying these questions. The world is a complicated place. And so there are so many instances where the array of questions is useful and is not something that's being done by scientists necessarily. So the disaster media stream that I have the honor of working on with my colleague Lisa Parks is one stream among all the other streams on the journal, where we've tried to proliferate these questions. And we want to, on the one hand, push back against the way media sensationalizes disaster. So we use the term disaster media critically, but we also want to talk about how media and disaster inhabit each other. And I will give an example of one of the articles to show the way that this particular great humanities scholar, J.D. Schnepp, thought about disaster media. And the article is about what happened during Hurricane Matthew, and begins with a story. So this is the image you're seeing in the PowerPoint. Floodwaters engulfed the town of Hope Springs, North Carolina, and a consumer drone pilot flew over the area and posted pictures to Instagram. A man in Texas saw the images, realized the situation that his brother was in. His brother was there in the area, trapped in his attic for 14 hours. And the man in Texas contacted the consumer drone pilot to try to, via Twitter, to try to fly over and attract attention of first responders to rescue the brother. And indeed, it was a heartening story, because the brother and his dog were rescued. So what does this article talk about? On the one hand, there is this unget-overable reduction of suffering that occurred through the drone pilot. But then J.D. Schnepp proliferates additional questions. She goes deeper and she looks at the way the media characterized the humanitarian drone pilot. And then she says, well, wait a minute, this characterization of these Good Samaritans and humanitarian drone pilots in this case, this characterization might actually contribute to the perception that we just need citizen to citizen rescue, and we don't necessarily need a whole government apparatus for first response. And so it could actually contribute to the privatization of rescue. And so those are the lines along which she develops her argument. And I just always feel in talking with people who aren't humanities scholars that the byword is complications ensue. So I recommend that article as one that's a great example of that. So if we could switch to the next article, this is an interview. I think Kathy Kasich is here with us today. Kathy Kasich, the filmmaker, interviewed Jonathan Marquis, who is the creator of these images from his series Down Waste. They're cyanotypes. And Jonathan is co-creating these cyanotypes, which I guess are, we can talk more about the sun prints. And he co-creates these art pieces, these photographs, or these images with the melting icebergs in Glacier National Park. So he sees himself as collaborating with a glacier in creating these images. So that raises a lot of questions about the agency of the elemental world that we can also talk about. And then finally, the next slide. We just published yesterday, because it's a stream and we can put up the articles as they're ready. We just published this article by Hele Hobart about this video poem by Kathy Jetnil Kitchener and Aka Niviana. So a Marshallese poet and a Greenland poet and filmmaker called Rise from One Island to Another. And the article by Hele Hobart is about the Cold War legacy and the legacy of the detonations of the nuclear bombs in the Marshall Islands, the test bombing of the Marshall Islands. So that article locates this poem within the context of this broader infrastructural unget-overable, disastrous unget-overable. And so this is there for you to read, and I recommend that, and I leave it there and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Janet, for taking us from the soil and sea level rises all the way up to drones. And thank you for the perfect segue, because you argued here for a proliferation of questions and speculation, and that's perfect. I want to alert our participants and attendees, start thinking of your questions. We'll do about 10 minutes or so of crosstalk between our presenters, and then we will open it up. We'll ask you to come on camera and join us on the screen for these really important and exciting dialogues about media plus environment, both the journal and our thinking. I want to thank our Janet, Stephen, Adriana, Linda, and Christina for quite a staggering survey of what the journal does. It is of enormous geographic scope and intellectual depth, and also across so many different forms. I'm going to actually ask some questions so that we can understand the whys, hows, and significances a little more about this journal. And I'm going to ask a question that I've been dying to ask, which is, why did you all start this journal? So why? And could I ask Alenda, could you start us off maybe?
Sure, I'm probably going to punt it right away to Janet or Adrian, because they were involved from the early inception. So I will pass it.
Okay, how about you, Adrian?
Why did we start it, Janet? I think
well, Adrian had an idea. This is the reason. Adrian had an idea. Take it, Adrian.
I think I'm the guilty one for proposing it at a session of the media and the environment, what is it called? Special interest group or something.
Scholarly interest group.
Scholarly interest group of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. And to me, it just seemed so obvious that this burgeoning interest in environment among these media scholars and film scholars, it had been growing for a number of years, and not just among media scholars, but among all kinds of people. And it seemed obvious that we need to bring together the people who work on environment from a kind of media angle and the people who work on media from an environment angle, and see where that goes, because there'd be a lot of public interest in that. And somehow, I guess, the idea caught on. We met a few years later. We got a grant from the Rachel Carson Center in Munich to get an international group of scholars together. And ultimately, this journal came out of it, as did a second journal as well, which we should mention, the Journal of Environmental Media, which is published by, is it Intellect?
Intellect.
Intellect Publishing. It's not open access. So we have two venues now, and others that are sort of joining to cover this field, this range of topics. Janet?
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, Hunter Vaughn and Meryl Shriver Rice are the two editors of the Environmental Media Journal, right? And and Jim Schwach was also with us when we started this idea of media plus environment. And it's Hunter and I had started the media and the environment scholarly interest group. And it's just quite remarkable that even when we started, which was what, 5 or so, I'm a little vague on this, so don't
10 years ago, maybe.
What was that?
More like 10 years ago, I think, no?
Somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago. There actually wasn't a specialization in our field on environmental media or media plus environment. And so it seemed natural for there to be one. And so as Adrian was saying, our journal was the first one, and the open access journal, and then right away, the other journal came to the fore, and now there are these two journals. So we hope that we will not, merely be there to publish existing work, but to help cultivate work and inspire work by scholars that can be done in this area.
And to grow a community around the journal of people conversing around these issues. Yeah,
Linda, let's get you in.
Well, I do realize that my own work is kind of an example of why this kind of journal is great, or why it needs to exist, because I work on ecology in the most unlikely place ever, which is video games. This is like right behind me in this image. And so, we have a lot of talented people who have written about nature writing, or nature film and other kinds of mode, landscape painting. And there's that rich tradition, but we have very few people who were writing about mediated environments, interactive environments, and so on. And so this is a chance to sort of give that niche an uplift, I think.
Of ecology and video games. I mean, some people might think those are polar opposite.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And what you're doing
don't you use a lot of energy, Alenda, in
that.
the video games?
Yeah, exactly. No, I know it's definitely a counterintuitive proposition, but I make it work.
I want to get Stephen in on this, because all three of you, Janet, Alenda, and Adrian, you use an ecological metaphor of cultivating this new field. Stephen, can you tell us what is your interest in working on the journal, and also your interest in working on environmental media as a graduate student?
Yeah, I think that we're at a point where it's really necessary, as Janet was speaking about during her brief talk, for scholars in the humanities, but especially younger scholars, to be able to ask difficult questions, think through these different scenarios in which we find ourselves, like we're all meeting on Zoom today, right? We're in a particular, we're using a medium as an environment, or a media as an environment. So these interconnections are things that we have to continue to think through. And one thing that I wanted to mention, going back to Adrian's point in regards to the public interest in this intersection between media and the environment, is the way in which, again, this is an open access journal. And for perhaps those who may not be familiar, basically that means that everyone is able to read it, to share it. which is not the case for all journals. Oftentimes there are paywalls and so on. And I also just want to applaud both the editors and then also our advisory board members that are here for allowing that to continue, because it is surprisingly difficult at various stages where various powers at play really want to put up a particular sort of paywall or a particular barrier for entry. And our editors and advisory board members have persisted and insisted that we make sure that it is open for all, which is something that I'm very proud of.
And it does exist because of the Carsey Wolf Center on our campus is the major sponsor. And then we have other institutional sponsors, thanks to Belinda Smale and Lisa Parks, but the Carsey Wolf Center, we couldn't exist without it. It's interesting, Christina and we have talked about this before, the way in which in other countries, such as Germany or Europe in general, there's a different model for open access.
Yeah. I want to pop it over to Christina because I want to follow up on some of the threads here. Christina, you talked about your symposium on modeling the Pacific, and you mentioned something that intrigued me, which was you said you were trying to model a dialogue, and then you were looking at where do we actually publish something like this. So I wonder if you could talk to us about, what does Media Plus Environment offer a project like yours that you couldn't get elsewhere?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's open access was a big part of the decision-making process because I have been trying to publish open access for a couple of years. And even though in Germany it's on the forefront because the German Research Foundation made it basically put out an obligation that if they fund any project in research, that they also want the publication to be open access. That's just, it doesn't always immediately translate into open access, but it was a big push because there was suddenly funding for it, which is the big issue behind open access. Who's funding this kind of publication? So there's an economic problem behind it, financing problem. And Media and Environment was, for me, actually, we also met through the Carsey Wolf Center because our conference was funded through the Carsey Wolf Center. And then they said, hey, do you know about Media and Environment, a project which we also fund? Why don't you guys, you guys should meet. And this is how I actually learned about the journal. I was fresh to campus. I just came from Germany. It was part of my orientation was really being pointed towards the journal. And then I thought this is actually really cool because Alenda, Stephen, Adrian, and Janet were so enthusiastic about exploring new formats, which is important to this project because, as I said in my 5 minutes, speaking with scientists about science and humanities is a task in itself, but publishing it is another problem because of the writing and formalization problem. And so it really Media and Environment made it possible for me and my collaborators to actually develop this bottom up, as The Economist says. So we had a problem and we had a journal, and from there we've been trying to figure out the best possible solutions, both from the publishing platform. Liba, I think our editor from UC Press is here too. She has been an amazing help. So it's really this experimental character of the conference could be translated into the publishing process, and that's still going on. And I'm really excited. I don't think I could have had that anywhere else, at least not to my knowledge. So this is really the type of journal that I like to support, that I like to work with, and that I think is adequate when it comes to these translation problems that environmental humanities or environmental media really face. Translation not just between different stakeholders, but also between different disciplines and discourses. So that's really what this journal, I think, accomplishes very well.
Yeah, I think I want to just remind our participants here that in just a little bit, we'll be opening it up for questions. We ask that you put your digital hand up, and we like to bring you right on screen here. Janet, it seems like you wanted to jump in, and then I have one more question before we open it.
One quick comment, which is that science journals have an easier time of being open access because they have the article processing fees that they collect from scientists who are publishing in the journal who are grant funded. So there's already a funding model there, where in the humanities that doesn't exist. And I'm glad you mentioned Liba, our managing editor from the UC Press, because she is here and she's been so helpful for us in figuring all of these questions out.
Hi, Leva.
Hi, Liba.
Maybe that's an
Hello,
opportunity.
hello, everybody. I wonder if we can just move along, because I want to really get to opening this up. You know, so many of all of your presentations have a theme of using words of transformation, reshaping, reconstituting, modeling, exploring, mediating, moving, rewilding, permeability, intertwining, sharing. And this is a view of the environment as dynamic and positive. Running an environmental film festival, sometimes you know, you're confronted often with the environment being the 3Ds, death, disease, and destruction. And your journal is really moving us in a very different direction. So I wonder if we can go back to that plus, which you've all insisted on when we made endless mistakes of calling it media and environment, and you said no plus. For our audience, which is a big general audience today, what debates, what contradictions, what struggles is media plus environment entering into, in media and environment, in academia, in the world, and in politics, you know, in lived life? So, you know, what are those debates? And of course, before we open it up, what about the plus? Okay, so I'm actually going to ask Janet if you could take that on, and then I'll bring some other people in.
Sure. Well, the first stream was wait, why am I just blanking? States of, right, okay, thank you, Elena. States of media plus environment. And our idea was that we were going to do the state of the field and curate short pieces that discuss the state of the field. And then we realized there is no one field. What would the field be? So now we just call it states of media plus environment. And I guess the plus is a way of proliferating the possibilities for these fields. And I think Adrian had a lot to say in the editorial of States of.
Yeah, Adrian.
What's the question again?
The question is the plus.
Well, the plus is I have nothing against the word and. I think it's about connection. It's about figuring out what the relationship is, what the many possible relationships are between media and environment, but also querying what those two terms are. You know, environment essentially means the area around something. Are we talking about the environment around humans? Is that all? And if so, then we're kind of left with this dualism of there are the humans on this planet and there's everything else, which we're calling environment. And I don't like that, you know, way of dividing the world. So you could say something similar about media. Media are the things like television, like cell phones, like Zoom, that we use to connect each other. But I think it's much more than that. There are more fruitful ways of thinking about it. And we just wanted that plus to indicate that sort of proliferation of unknowns, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, excellent. Alenda, on the plus.
Yeah, I kind of was almost jumping to the other part of the question too, which is—
Oh, sure, you can do the other part, sure.
Well, it kind of addresses the plus, because I've been thinking a lot about Sean Cubbett's Finite Media book, which he's actually one of our editorial advisory board members. But on page 6 or something, he has this really just stunning statement, which is even communicating one's love of nature implies damaging it. And I just had to like put the book down when I read that, because it's this huge, it's kind of the big you know, elephant in the room in terms of environmental media studies, which is, you know, how do we do this work when it implies, you know, resource extraction and e-waste and energy consumption and use, But we still obviously find value in the mediation and in culture. And so I think part of the work of the plus is like inhabiting this uncomfortable conjunction and trying to stay there rather than leaving it because it's uncomfortable.
That's a great thing. And Stephen, you have your hand up, so I'm going to
Sure,
get you
yeah.
in. And I want to, just before you speak, want to remind our audience, after Stephen, I'm going to open it up to our participants. So hope you have questions ready. If you're posting questions or comments in the chat, because we're having difficulty just focusing on two things, I'm going to ask anyone who did that to just raise your digital hand and we'll get you on screen so we can all enjoy your ideas. Stephen.
Yeah, so just quickly to this question of the plus, I think for me as a young scholar whose research has been molded in part by the development of the journal, for me it's come to kind of stand in for something like entanglement in the sense of the ways in which communities are using media as tools of resistance, the ways in which they're using it as tools of resistance to other extractive environmental practices, right? And so the ways in which these questions of both representation and liberation work against these forces that have become global, and if we're not unable to address them, of course, then there will be serious consequences, of course, in terms of climate change and so on. So the way in which the journal is speaking to these different aspects of the environment and of media, for me is very exciting.
Wonderful. The idea of entanglements there. I'd like to open it up now to our participants and attendees. If you have a question or a comment, please put your digital hand up, and I'm going to ask our producers to alert me who's there. Yes, Rahul Mukherjee. You need to unmute,
Yes.
Rahul.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, Patty. Hi, Janet. Hi, Yolanda. So I had it was wonderful listening to all of you, and this was a great discussion. Also, the FLEFF posters are great. Just wanted to ask one thing, which I think, the nomenclature streams that you use, but you also have issues, like just the usual journal format of issues. And I was curious, I mean, the streams make sense in many ways in the way you want to keep it fluid. It has all the both the kind of ecological / also the video metaphors of today's internet and so on and so forth. But the issue remains as a kind of citational practice maybe, or something that it becomes easier to cite maybe, and that's how the convention goes. So I was curious how you kind of both reconcile or maybe leave it unconciled, the two things together, the issue and the stream in the journal.
This is Alenda, clearly.
I guess, no, I mean, I was just a joke, it's just that we have issues with the stream. but
That's a great joke.
It's been a pain actually, is trying to conform our like more fluid model to traditional academic publishing. And UC Press and Scholastica, the platform that we're on for the site, has tried to be very accommodating, but there are limitations to how flexible they can be. So like you said, in order to be legible to databases and library systems and search queries, you have to still have all these typical identifiers. So we kind of have to play it both ways, at least for now.
Yeah.
And we should mention that Rahul has a great piece on J.C. Bose and
electrosensitivity,
yes,
and well, the botanical plants, right? It's an excellent essay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks again. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Rahul. Again, we're opening it up to participants and attendees to ask questions. Just pop up your digital hand and we'll get you in on the conversation. Kaylee Arnold. And you need to unmute. Thanks, Kaylee.
Hi. So you started to talk about kind of the working between the school of thought where there's the difference between how your scholarly object of media, it can lead to the degradation of the environment, but it's also creating new knowledge. And I was wondering if just kind of knowing that and working around that in your field, if that kind of changes or if you're conscious of that in the way that you're publishing and creating the journal, how you go about doing interviews, the way that you are like now meeting online together, if you're conscious of like the platforms that you're using and the platforms that you're using for publishing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for foregrounding that dilemma that we see as, I mean, I see it as a painful dilemma, and it's irreconcilable ultimately. But you just hope to move to the low tech and hope that zooming in will ultimately produce less of a massive carbon footprint than had we all flown to be together. And you hope that media can help you develop efficiencies. So for example, Jennifer Gabris talks about this, and she talks about how there's this this trash track program that is for organizing waste streams, so that the energy that you use in firing up your computer, your advanced computing, ends up accruing to environmental good. But yeah, it's irreconcilable. I mean, there is no perfect technological solution to our plight.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Christina. Did you want to weigh in on this, Christina?
Well, I can't really speak for the journal because I'm just a stream editor. But, when it comes to environmental sciences, I think that there's actually something that I learned from the scientist. I worked with an engineer, a robotics engineer, and we did this kind of toy problem. We tried to build our own oceanographical sensor, like a little floater device that could take images and GPS data in front of the coast of Santa Barbara. And I learned that it's actually a big field of exploration right now among oceanographers and marine scientists to figure out how to deal with this problem of waste that is created by observing the ocean. Because a lot of these floaters never actually return home. They just add to the big garbage gyres that develop in the oceans, and that this problem of herding and observing is actually something that at least the scientists I've spoken to are very conscious about, maybe more so than in the humanities, where we kind of, most of us, I think, tend to forget that what we do and that our observations actually have material impact. For a long time, I don't think that was very much on the mind of scholars. But of course, there's also a little bit of an asymmetry when it comes to environmental impact. But for me, it's been interesting to listen to scientists and how they actually start reconfiguring the way they design or think about the design of technology and how that could actually be realized in more sustainable ways. And so we were actually just speaking, the robotics engineer, Sotiria Lampudi, and I, if we could actually realize something like our little floating device from completely compostable materials. The problem is the cell phone inside. So we haven't really found any compostable cell phone replacements. But I think it's really, it's the creativity that comes along with these questions is really the part that I like about it most. Finding different solutions and searching for creative solutions.
Yeah, that's a great point about searching for creative solutions. I find when I was preparing for today and I was reading through the journal, I thought this is the antidote to death, disease, and destruction in environmental worlds, right? The journal seems to be constantly, aggressively looking for solutions. Are there any more questions from our participants on this session? We'll get you in to the conversation and we'll pop you onto the screen. Anybody else? Because we're looking here. Okay, so I think we're going to move to our takeaways, final thoughts, final reflections, call to action, manifestos, conundrum section. And before I ask each of you to share 1 or 2 minutes of your final thoughts to close out this session, I do want to give a heads up to all of our participants that this is a celebration of media plus environment. And immediately following this session, we will have an after party in the Zoom room. So bring your water bottles and your cocktails, and we'll do a toast to the Journal and to Janet, Stephen, Adrian, Alenda, and Christina. So let's move to takeaways. And I'd like to ask each of you to share final thoughts, takeaways from our session, continuing conundrums, calls to action, or anything you'd like to leave with our participants today. And I'm going to ask you, Adrian, to go first, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, thank you. So I think my final thoughts are really a kind of response to that last question, which I'm going to address in 2 ways. So the question being about the material impacts of what we do, of whether it's flying to Stockholm. And there's a good example, because we were invited to speak at a conference, an environmental humanities conference in Stockholm, which was supposed to have taken place last August. It was postponed because of the pandemic. And this year they decided to hold it virtually next year. And I have to admit that I felt a little torn about that, because I was looking forward to going to Stockholm. Now, what does that do with my values? I realized that it would have been burned a lot more carbon to get there, but I would have stayed. I'm going to Europe anyway, and it would have been, so there are various kind of calculations that one could make to answer that question of whether it's better to fly somewhere, drive somewhere, or Zoom somewhere. And Laura Marx's article was really helpful, which was all about the expense, the environmental, ecological impacts of using computers to stream, as we are doing now. But for me, it kind of comes back around to a question, an ethical or a moral question. We are alive, we consume in order to live, and as we consume, we incur debts. And it's up to each of us to decide how to repay those debts. And there's no way around that. Many people just ignore them and don't even consider that they might have debts to others or to the world, to the earth. But that's kind of a fact of life for me. And you have to decide how you're going to repay those debts. You won't do it in every single possible way. And I'm not a technician who can develop we could probably use a great app that would help us make decisions around everything we do, everything we buy, everything we eat, every decision we make. We need those apps, but I'm not the one to do it. And I'm not going to think of those questions. So that's a kind of answer 1 to that question. The other, maybe extended, more global answer that I've been thinking recently is, from a lot of people's perspective, the world is about meaning. The world makes sense or it doesn't. And if you were brought up in a traditional culture, in a religious culture or something, the world makes sense. And right now, things don't seem to be working so well, the pandemic, climate change, and so on. So what are we doing wrong? And I started thinking that we've had the last 500 years to develop the infrastructure so that we can communicate globally, and so that we can know what's going on the planet. We've got those satellites, and we've got those sensors that the environmental scientists that Christina and Janet were talking about are using to measure what's happening, to help us live better globally. Now it's time to put away all the other baggage that came with the systems, the economic, political systems that had to create that infrastructure for us. It's time to throw out what we don't need and figure out how to live in a different way. And the pandemic is a kind of wake-up call. Maybe we won't be going on trips to the tropics every winter. Maybe the host and guest relationship, which is a global one around the global tourist industry, the largest industry on the planet, will have to go away in large part. Maybe
Okay,
we'll have to
Adrian, I
live
need
more-
to interrupt you
Okay.
only because we have the 10 minutes
Sure,
up,
sure,
and
sorry.
I have to get 4 people in. So
You
I'd
got me
like,
going, sorry.
it was wonderful. It was so passionate and so wonderful. But I need to ask each of our presenters in your wrap up. I'm going to stick to a strict 2-minute rule. So next, Christina.
Okay, I'll do it really short. I'm really looking forward to all the new formats that media and environment is in the means of developing and will be developing in the future to present this kind of knowledge in all possible forms, like podcasts, videos, films, texts. And I'm really looking forward to the constellations that, you know, might result out of these experiments. And it was a pleasure to be here.
Oh, thank you so much. And next, Alenda.
Yeah, I think I'm going to highlight the work of my colleague at UCSB, David Pello, who's been calling for critical environmental justice studies, and what he sees as the difference between that and first wave EJ is sort of a more intersectional approach. So rather than focusing on one lens like race or class, to think intersectionally, and also to think outside of legislation and policy reform as really the only, you know, effective avenue for action. Not that that's not important. And I think that's where our journal has a role to play, and where that plus also comes in, is to think intersectionally, coalition building, you know, from feminist practice, and that's what I'd like to see going ahead.
Oh, excellent. Stephen.
Yeah, so just building off of Alinda's point, I think it's been remarkable, again, as the coordinating editor, to be in contact with people from all around the globe in terms of building, you know, coalitions, in terms of scholarship, in terms of doing, you know, what small bit we can to support important activist movements. And so I think for me, I'm just really looking forward to the ways in which the journal will continue to center the usages of media when it comes to challenging extractive practices, looking towards sustainable futures, while centering, you know, these communities that have been marginalized and left out of the conversation, such as indigenous communities and so on. So I think those potentialities for me are just something that will continue to motivate me through doing my small part with the journal.
Thank you, Stephen. And Janet.
Yeah, likewise. I know this is a celebration of the journal, but I am a trauma studies scholar. And so I do think that at this moment, my goal is less to imagine mistakenly that the journal can solve climate disruption, but I think that the journal can participate and build coalitions, as you were saying, Stephen, with various communities that are facing things in the here and now. And so for one example, and I'm thinking of the research of Jai-Ching Chen, we think that solar is the answer, solar is great. Well, when you manufacture solar cells, photovoltaic cells, and solar panels and arrays and this kind of thing, it actually does require the installation of new coal-fired plants. And in China, Chen talks about how putting in the solar panel factory or the solar cell factory required the displacement of farmers from the area who are now, you know, displaced. So there are no easy answers. And I really like the specificity of individual articles that we publish that deal with specific problems. And yes, for me too, the environmental justice piece seems the most inspiring and empowering. So it's not, I don't really see it as gloom and doom, although it can certainly be that, but the place to put one's effort and one's commitment. So I guess I wanted to say media plus environment plus justice.
Yes.
is my motto for the journal.
And that plus allows you all to keep adding on. I want to thank you for those wonderful takeaways. And I was taking notes while you were doing it so that I could provide what I think has become a little bit of a speculative manifesto on how to think about media plus environment. Adrian says we need to repay those debts. Christina says, there's a proliferation of new formats to present knowledge in new kinds of constellations. Alenda says we must really think about critical environmental justice studies as intersectional and think outside and beyond policies, creating coalitions, although policy is still important. I have to know because my programming partner, Tom Chevery, writes on policy. And Stephen asks us to think about the globe transnationally, and particularly about coalitions and the usages of media to combat and challenge extractive capitalism in order to create sustainable futures. And Janet reminds us that at the basis of all this work is trauma, and that the journal can perhaps be leveraged to build coalitions and to galvanize communities to join together to fight for the potentials of a just future. I'd like everyone now to unmute, go on camera, and I'd like everyone to give a big bravo as we celebrate Media the Environment. Hang on, and I hope you'll join us for our after party. Bravo, everybody.
Bravo. Thank you,
Yay.
Patty. And thank you all so much.
Thank you,
for
Tom.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bravo.
Really
bravo.
appreciate your being an audience. Thank
Yes,
you.
and we'll have a little outro and then we'll see you in the lobby. All right, Annie, we need to get out of the spotlight and into the gallery.